Here to speak about the war and Canada's relationship with Moscow is Canada's ambassador to Russia, Sarah Taylor. Hi, Ambassador. It's good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time for this.
Not at all. My pleasure.
I do have a number of questions about the relationship with Russia and your role specifically, but I want to start off with that news that the U.S. is ready to allow its weapons in a limited capacity to be fired by Ukraine into Russia. What is your sense about the degree to which Putin will view that as an escalation?
Well, just let me start by saying that as you said, Canada has taken a similar stance. Minister Joly has been very clear on that, about allowing Canadian armaments to be used in line with our arms trade treaty. And I think that's a very important decision. And I think, to be honest, it highlights to some extent the hypocrisy of the position that Putin has taken. Because he's created this sort of imaginary red line that arms that were legally purchased can somehow not be used in a war by Ukraine. I mean, there's no rule in international law that says that a country can't use weaponry that it has purchased elsewhere. And meanwhile, of course, Russia itself is using arms that it has bought from Iran and from North Korea. And unlike Ukraine, those have in fact been purchased illegally, going against UN sanctions. So again, Minister Joly spoke out very clearly on our concern about how Russia is violating UN sanctions on North Korea by purchasing arms from them.
Putin never usually seems to be too bothered by being called a hypocrite or the prospect of hypocrisy. I'll sort of circle back to where I started. Do you think he will view this as an escalation and act in turn? Or do you think there is incentive on his side as well not to essentially engage in escalatory action with countries outside of Ukraine?
Well, it's very hard sometimes to see inside the mind and the thinking of President Putin and of the Kremlin. But I would say two things. One is that the Kremlin does have a bit of a track record of making threats that it doesn't necessarily follow through on. So I certainly wouldn't take as gospel everything that the president is saying about his response. I think also, again, that this sort of rhetoric is actually part of a broader Russian approach, a strategy on the war. And so that it's very important that we be aware of that and that we not necessarily let ourselves be unduly constrained. Of course, no one wants escalation, but at the same time, I think part of the Russian strategy is to try and convince allies of Ukraine that anything reasonable that we do is somehow escalatory. So I think we do need to take those statements coming out of the Kremlin with a bit of a grain of salt.
You have a unique vantage point that basically nobody else I'm able to talk to has, which is that you can engage with Russians on these issues. And, as you pointed out, it's difficult to know what's in Putin's head, essentially. So putting that aside for a second, I'm wondering, since your arrival during your time in Russia, if you have been able to garner a sense from Russians themselves about whether they are concerned about escalation beyond the war they're currently engaged in.
I think ordinary Russians, I mean, it's rather difficult to gauge public opinion here. Yeah. But I do have a sense that ordinary Russians are not very happy about the war, would like to see an end to it. Of course, some of the bravest voices who have spoken out against the war are now in jail. So those voices have to some extent been repressed. But I think even for just the general population, that this was not a war that they wanted or expected either. And I think there would be a lot of support for an end to hostilities. So it's again, it's a little difficult to judge. But I don't think there's a great depth of public support for the war. The one other thing I would say that really struck me and during my time here, of course, one of the sad events since I've arrived here was the death of Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who was died in prison. And really striking to me how many Russians, ordinary Russians, turned out for his funeral. I went and tried to attend his funeral, and there were thousands of people there. Calling out his name and calling out anti-war slogans. So to me, that said something about the depth of hidden opinion there is. People who maybe in normal circumstances can't express themselves in Russia, but who are really unhappy about the war.
At that, it's such a great example because at that moment they did essentially show it publicly, right? And it's one of the only public instances that we've seen of sentiment like that since the war began. Do you think Putin cares?
I think he does. I think, I mean, this is a state that worries very much about domestic security. And we can see that in the crackdown that there has been in recent years domestically on freedom of speech, on human rights, on good governance. And that, along with the war in Ukraine, is the most concerning trend for us right now in Russia, and is one of the drivers for our approach of limited engagement with Russia. So even if it doesn't show on the surface, I would say yes, Putin and those in the Russian government are actually very concerned, very worried about dissenting views within the Russian population.
You mentioned our policy of limited engagement. How would you describe the utility of your role to Canadians watching right now?
Very good question. And I know there are some who ask, why do we even have an embassy in Moscow? So I would say two things. The first is that embassies and diplomatic relations are they're not a gift we give to friends. They're a tool that we use to advance Canadian interests. And so in difficult circumstances, it becomes all the more important to be able to have those tools to advance Canadian interests. And then the second thing would be just to give you a few examples of what we do and why the embassy is here and what our function is. That obviously part of it is trying as much as we can to engage with the Russian government and to pass messages from the Canadian government to send Canadian viewpoints to the Russian government. But we also do a number of other things. I mean, we coordinate with some of our like-minded partners in working together here, again, to try and express views to the Russian government. We meet with and support as much as we can the very brave members of civil society and Russian opposition voices that are still active here. And of course, we also support and help Canadians. There are Canadian citizens here who need our help, consular cases, businesses, including Canadian companies who've been trying to divest from Russia. So those are all areas where we can provide some concrete assistance.
Okay, just before I let you go, Ambassador, in those meetings you have had, if you peel back the curtain to the degree that you're able to, what would you describe it is like to Canadians who are watching right now?
Oh, it's interesting in that Russian officials are, I would say, are very correct with us. So certainly with me when I meet with them. I mean, it's not that we're yelling at one another. It's a formal and correct conversation. But it is quite limited in my engagements with the Foreign Ministry. Of course, my starting point has to be our very strong opposition to Russia's illegal, unjustified war in Ukraine. And I mean, the Russians term us an unfriendly country. That's the expression they use. But I mean, from my perspective, we're not unfriendly. We're just waiting for them to change their policy. And if they were to end this war, then obviously, our relations would be on a very different footing. So that really is sort of what dominates the conversations. But we also have practical matters that we need to manage running the embassy here, dealing with consular cases. And as I said, on those practical things, it's quite a correct, acceptable exchange of views.
Just very quickly, pardon me, just to pick up on something you said there. Do you really think even if they ended the war, that the relationship could be on a different footing? I mean, you mentioned some of the issues with civil society and democracy, the way in which they treat their own citizens. It's not just what they've done to Ukraine, is it not?
Absolutely, and we have grave concerns about human rights, democratic development, all and freedom of expression in Russia, and those are things that have been longer term trends. So it's absolutely not to say that if the war ended, that suddenly we're friends again and everything goes back to the way it was, but just to say that I think the war in Ukraine is at the moment a primary barrier to a change in the relationship, and that we wouldn't even be able to contemplate moving to a different place until the war ends and until Ukraine's sovereignty and borders and territorial integrity are respected.
Understood. Ambassador, I appreciate you making the time for the conversation. Thank you so much.
Not at all. My pleasure. It's good talking to you.
You as well. That's Canada's ambassador to Russia.